Good morning, everybody. I think I'm good, thank you. Anna, thank you very much for kicking us off with tremendous energy and passion. I'm Christiana Riley. I'm the president and CEO of Santander in the United States. It's my pleasure this morning to be picking up where Anna left off, starting us into a path, I think, of a great set of conversations today, all focused on the urgency of growth. Anna framed the problem well. The lack of growth globally represents the most significant threat to our financial stability. And moving into the conversation of our panel now, recognizing that alongside that significant threat, geopolitical instability only further exacerbates that issue. And so it's my tremendous pleasure to invite my two panelists to the stage. We're going to kick off the conversation today focused on the set of geopolitical risks, kind of baselining the set of assumptions of the environment that we're dealing with. So Nadia and Patrick, would you please join me on the stage? So the first session of the day, and I want to introduce my panelists properly. I'm joined immediately here on my left by Nadia Schadlow. Nadia served in the first Trump administration as the architect of the US security agenda, as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump. Today, she is a sought-after geopolitical analyst at the Hudson Institute, and we are absolutely thrilled, Nadia, to be able to rely on your insights today. Nadia is also joined by General Patrick Saunders, a 40-year veteran of the UK Army, most recently retired as one of the UK's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the General of Staff of the UK Army. So we're bringing both political and military experience to bear in today's panel. And I think it's probably worthwhile setting the goal of the panel up front. Often you can come to a conference like this and we'll set the geopolitical risk panel and we can go deep, deep, deep down a rabbit hole on many issues. And of course we have the expertise here to do that. But the goal today is really to make this panel relevant to the decision makers who are in the room. And in that framing of recognizing that the growth and the lack of growth being such a critical issue of stability in the world, understanding how the geopolitical risks really, and what is it that the decision makers in this room really need to focus on, recognize, and understand around the geopolitical environment as we navigate through our world. And so, Nadia, with that, I would like to open up with the first question to you, of course, as an insider in the first administration. If you could share with us some of your perspectives on what are the key foreign policy priorities for the administration, and how should the decision makers in this room be thinking about how those weigh on our agendas, and what should we be how should we be thinking about navigating through?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love Madrid, so it's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much. I mean, I think I'll step back for a minute and just tie a couple of comments back to Anna's remarks about growth, because it really occurred to me, as much as sometimes, this might cause some discomfort, President Trump actually, like his three main operational concepts of how he approached things, I think align very much with the message of growth being important. So if you look at deregulation, a word we can say in the United States and use often, so he's driving deregulation, he's driving an approach toward energy costs that's focused on energy diversification as opposed to climate, which is different because it puts you in a different set of circumstances in which you prioritize. And third, he's focused on coalitions of the willing, meaning sort of in a polite way saying, we're not going to begin with multilateral processes that bureaucratize and create sclerosis. We're going to create smaller coalitions to drive change. And I think those three ways, his operating concepts of how he approaches things, we saw in Trump 1 and in Trump 2, and I think they're quite consistent with thinking about growth, about how you achieve it by driving it in that way. Now, in terms of foreign policy priorities, I mean, I think we've seen a sense of He sees the world as one in which over the years began to disadvantage the United States. So we've seen themes of burden sharing, which Trump 1, Trump 2, and which have actually worked. A sense of making sure that what happens in our neighborhood we pay more attention to. A sense also of China as a strategic competitor, although I think he sees China not necessarily as an ideological threat, but as a serious strategic competitor, and that also puts you in a different place. And I think there's a division in the administration now about that approach to China to a degree too, but I'll leave it at that.
So we will absolutely come back to the U.S.-China relationship. But Patrick, I want to offer you then the counter perspective to share a little bit the European response to that and Europe's perspectives on the Trump agenda, the set of priorities that Nadia has laid out. And I would agree that the objective has been very much around catalyzing growth and the kind of agenda and priorities. How does the European view respond to that?
So Europe, I think, is facing two profound challenges. The first is the return of history. So the Cold War is bracketed by two famous quotes. The first is Frank Fukuyama's declaring the end of history, comes at the end of the Cold War. The one that comes at the beginning of the Cold War is Antonio Gramsci, who talks about the old world is dying, the new world struggling to be born, now is the time of monsters. And I'm not suggesting that Trump is one of those monsters, but he's having a causal effect. Of course, the other consequence, the other threat that Europe is facing is Russia. And this resurgence of imperial, expansionist, but these are returns to a norm. And it's worth reminding ourselves, because I think as a generation we've been lucky enough to be able to forget this, what war is. And for the last 80 years we have been spared it. But the truth is that there are four things we know about war. The first is that war is frequent. So if you're Russian, in the millennia from 900 to 1900, you only have 25 years of uninterrupted peace. If you're English, you have 56 out of every 100 years you're at war during that millennium. Wars spread, they metastasize. They're extraordinarily expensive. So in the UK, defense spending is 2.7% in 1937. It is 10% in 1939. It's 50% in 1945, and we only repaid our debts to the US in 2006. So it is a lot cheaper to prevent wars, but war is just part of the norm, and it's something that we as a generation have forgotten. So Europe faces these two challenges of the return of history, represented by Russia, and then the disruptive effect that Trump is having in terms of accelerating what were already existing trends in the global order. And Europe has many qualities and many strengths, but it hasn't yet found the unity that's required to face up to some of those challenges.
The arc of history and the way you describe it is very stark, and you talk about the luxury, the privilege we've had to forget about the norm. There's one part of the European continent, however, that has not had that luxury, and I know, Patrick, that you've had firsthand experience just within the past couple of months of spending some time in Ukraine. And I wondered, lest we forget the tragedy that is unfolding in Ukraine, maybe you could share with us some of your firsthand experience and insights and analysis on the state of the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, before I dive down into sort of what's going on in the battlefield and how people feel, and it is a place to go to where it's impossible not to be struck by, how you can move from a normal society functioning, people going shopping, people sending their kids to school one day, and the next, everything changes, and it can happen that quickly. So Ukraine, let's sort of step back a little bit. Ukraine is in this new Cold War that we are engaged in, where arguably the epicenter is Taiwan rather than Berlin. Ukraine at this point in that Cold War is the fulcrum on which everything hinges. Now, the prospects for a peaceful, rapid conclusion to this war are incredibly remote. Because if you think about war, war is an extension. This is, let's find a dead German general to quote. War is an extension of politics by other means. So the war aims of the two sides are almost completely irreconcilable. Putin has three aims. The first is to subjugate Ukraine, to reduce it to a disarmed vassal state, and potentially to control more than simply the territory that he's claiming at the moment. But it's also to restore Ruski Mir, the wider, greater Russia, and the territories that were traditionally associated with historic Russia. And it's to dismantle the European security architecture and find a way of bringing about the conclusion of what's kept us safe over the last 40 years. Those three aims have not changed since the start of the war. The latest round of negotiations with President Trump, or prospective ones, got us absolutely nowhere. And so his theory of victory is to isolate Ukraine, it's to grind them down, to bleed them white through attrition, and he's not going to stop. So the only way you can bring about him stopping is to make sure that you can sustain Ukraine in the fight, and to impose costs. And by costs, these are not just costs on the battlefield, these are economic costs. So when we talk about sanctions on Russia, we should be going with Graham Blumenthal, which would get through Congress, I think. Ukraine's theory of victory is to be like Finland. You think about sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. I know, because I've spoken to Yermak, that Ukraine would absolutely recognize the reality of their situation in terms of territory. The crucial thing for Ukraine is to maintain its sovereignty, its independence, its choice. And Finland provides a model for how you can do that. Finland emerging from the Winter War. So this isn't going to be decided on the battlefield, although there is much that we have to learn from what is going on the battlefield. It's not going to be decided in Kyiv or in Moscow. It's going to be decided in Brussels and in Beijing. And Beijing is the center of gravity. China is the center of gravity for this war, because at the moment, as Wang Yi told Kaja Kallas, it's not in China's interests for this war to end anytime soon. Now, the human cost on the battlefield is extraordinary. The human cost in places like Kyiv. If you go to Kyiv and you stay there, you'll download an app on your telephone that will sound 5-6 times a day, telling you to take shelter from the air raids. I left it on just to remind myself of what daily life was like in Kyiv, because you can lose it very, very quickly. And they're exhausted. But exhaustion does not mean that they're defeated their will. So Ukraine will find a way to fight on for at least another 2 or 3 years. They'll do that for us. They'll be defending Europe. And we have to find a way of doing two things: of sustaining Ukraine economically and militarily, whilst at the same time using that time to rearm ourselves. Because you get to a moment sometime between 27 and 2030 where you end up with a potential for a polycrisis, where you have threats in Europe manifesting and threats in the Indo-Pacific manifesting. I'm sorry, I've talked for a long time. I'll stop.
No, it was a very thorough answer, and on obviously a very critical security hotspot. I want to draw both of you in on the question. You talked about the resolution of the tensions in this emerging Cold War being resolved in Brussels and Beijing, notably not Washington. I presume the reference was to NATO. And so, question first to Patrick, but then Nadia on the same question. Is NATO the solution, or is one of the war objectives, or maybe a byproduct, an unexpected byproduct of the tension, NATO's irrelevance, NATO's dissolution? What is the future of NATO from each of your respective perspectives?
I was kind of hoping you go first.
Okay, yeah. NATO is not irrelevant, and unfortunately, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reminded everyone why NATO needs to exist. I think we've seen over the past few years NATO becoming, or at least taking steps to become more robust. Defense spending is increasing. I'm actually a proponent of I believe that European defense spending and European defense capabilities should grow under the NATO rubric as opposed to the European Union. I know that not everyone agrees with that, but I think that that ultimately will solidify and be better for the transatlantic alliance. But NATO certainly is not irrelevant. The key will be developing the capabilities NATO needs, and the key will be fulfilling the promises now that European states are making to increase defense spending and translating that into actual capabilities. And that will be tough, right? It's hard. I mean, there's still all the reasons Anna pointed out in terms of regulatory issues, the inability to act with speed and at scale. And in the midst of all of that, we're actually sort of debating what kinds of militaries we should have. What should they look like? Should we have militaries with tanks, with drones? What's the role of autonomy? And those are really important issues in the rebuilding, in the kinds of areas and in decisions in the defense sector about where we put our money. We're having those debates in the US. Can we do everything autonomously? I think not. Drones can do a lot, but drones can't control territory over time. Drones alone will not solve Ukraine's problem. So NATO is relevant, but those decisions are also taking place within NATO, and we have to act with more speed.
Patrick.
So the alliance is a relative alliance. It's only relevant when it's relative to a threat. So we've got to understand what threat we're facing, and I've talked about that a little bit. But it is a combination of something that is old wine in new bottles, which is political warfare. So the sort of sub-threshold threats that we're facing from Russia and of course China as well are going to persist because they're hard to deal with. And they're a way of probing, of destabilizing, of keeping us off balance. But we dealt with this all the way through the first Cold War. So having the tool set to be able to respond to the sort of hybrid gray zone warfare that manifests itself coming out of Russia in the same way that we did so skillfully, guided by George Kennan as a strategy, is the first thing that NATO has to respond to. And we're finding a way of doing it. I think that our response, for example, by not overreacting to some of the Russian air incursions has been the right one. You've got to be patient. Don't respond symmetrically to these sort of threats. And then you have the territorial threat. And the territorial threat is real. Incredible as it may seem, sitting here in Madrid, a long, long way from these front lines, if you sit in Northern Europe, or you sit in the Baltics, or you sit in Central Europe, the combination of history and geography tells you that sooner or later, Russia is going to do something to you. And when the objective is to destabilize NATO and to question Article 5, they don't have to do a broad advance across the central German plain or through Poland to do that. They just have to seize enough territory quickly, tuck down behind a tactical nuclear umbrella, and say to NATO, what are you going to do? And that is where I have concerns, because I think NATO has got extraordinary strengths and has got extraordinary relevance. It's bigger than it was, it's more united than it was, it has a set of plans that are now much more fit for purpose and relevance. It's well led by both politically and militarily, and it is beginning to do enough, not at the right pace of urgency, to be able to address some of the deficiencies that we have in capability, but also crucially in readiness. But as long as there is a doubt about the political cohesion, about the commitment to Article 5 by some of its members, and it's not just the United States, it could be others as well, that poses an existential threat to NATO and thus to Europe's security. So the way you respond to that is by being much more front-footed. And rather than assuming that you can deter Russia through punishment, which has manifestly failed so far, you have to deter it by denial. And that means having forces positioned forward on the frontiers, in the areas where we are most vulnerable, from all European nations, where you're kind of in from the start. And that's we're not going to know until the US Global Force Posture Review reveals quite how much the US are going to leave in Europe. But as well as the critical enablers that we can't do without until we build our own capacities, it is important that we have boots on the ground, because it's a signal of commitment to the alliance.
We've got 7 minutes left, and I've got two critical topics that I really want to make sure that we cover. European rearmament, and then I do want to take us into the Pacific theater to talk about the threat of China that Nadia, you rightly raised. So we may have to do a little like my teenagers do, a bit of TikTok pace to get through this. Before we cover those, I have one. Give me a yes, no, 10-second answer so that we make sure that we don't ignore the Middle East. Most recent peace deal, will it hold, yes or no?
It will provide a foundation going forward for a better outcome in the Middle East.
Diplomatically said, foundation going forward.
Yeah.
No.
No. Okay. So European rearmament, critical for the audience in the discussion today, and is it a catalyst for growth? What are the blockers to a successful European rearmament? What role, again, framing this discussion around the constituents here, what role do we need banks to be playing? So what chances do you give a successful European rearmament?
I'm not sure in terms of percentage, but in terms of it is linked to the common market idea and the common market obstacles. So there's still a persistent unwillingness across Europe to cooperate. There's still a national perspective on rearmament, and reconciling that with a common market will be important and will continue to be both an obstacle but also an opportunity for growth. Debt, defense budgets, and a concept of what types of militaries we should be building, I think will also continue to create some tension.
It's going to be messy for all the reasons that Nadia points to. The fragmentation, the duplication that we have across the European market. And my concern is not will we rearm, and will we rearm in a particularly efficient way? Because the answer to the first is yes, we will rearm. I don't think we'll do it as efficiently as we can. My concern is will we do it fast enough? And there is, I think, this acute threat window that we're coming into between about 27 and 2030, where we will not have got ourselves into a sufficiently robust position. The role that banks play, I mean, one of the reasons that I was very interested in, delighted to join Santander, is because I think Santander has spotted both the moral imperative, where we've reversed the polarity from it being unethical to invest in defense to now it being unethical not to be prepared to defend your societies. And they are class leading in terms of the defense policy that they have, but also because there is an enormous macro opportunity here. And so many of the technologies that we need to be supporting, particularly with the SMEs and the neo-primes, are actually dual use and will become accelerants of the sort of growth that Anna was talking about.
Thank you for the observation on the way in which banks really do have a moral obligation, right? If we all have a deep belief in the criticality of defending freedom and Western values, then indeed it is an obligation, right, to support. I guess the question that now may take us to the question of China and the threat of China is linked to rearmament. Are we rearming in the right way and relative to the right to the right view of where the conflict is going, right? There's a risk that we, I think, are too focused on the traditional form of kinetic warfare, a hot war, as opposed to what we're more likely dealing with in a longer outlook of the rising tension and conflict with China, which is unlikely to be a traditional kinetic, but rather more of a cold warfare. Thoughts on, are we perceiving that threat in the right way? Are we perhaps deeper into the conflict already when we think about the war for dominance, for example, in supply chains, focus on the criticality of supply chains, for example, for rare earth minerals. So thoughts on the US-China relationship and where we go.
Right, well, I think That's a critical point, because rearmament ultimately depends a lot on China, not in a good way, right? The critical inputs to rearmament are essentially controlled by China in many respects, whether it's rare earths, mineral processing, magnets. China makes about 90% of the world's magnets. Almost any military platform we need depends upon magnets. So there are disconnects both for European rearmament and American rearmament, right? And now we're seeing an entire conversation shift really over the past 8 years on recognizing that, but we're still lagging in our ability to change the actual dynamics. It takes a long time to shift those supply chains. Overall, are we, great power competition is back, and by that I mean recognizing the importance of power in the international system. I think that was an important point of Trump 1 and bringing that out, and now we see in the EU Commissioner's speech from September, the European State of the Union, power and great power competition was a central point in that. So I think we are focused on the right things. The problem always is the lag in implementation.
Yeah, and I can only reinforce what Nadia was saying about the importance of rare earths. At the moment, we're in a position where China has an absolute veto over our rearmament, because in order to be competitive in an era that is passing through the fourth industrial revolution with the sort of technologies that are going to become decisive on the battlefield. So yes, tanks are still going to matter, artillery is still going to matter, people are still going to matter, but you have to lay on top of that and combine that with the sort of disruptive frontier edge technologies that we're seeing being deployed in places like Ukraine and elsewhere. And they all depend on rare earths. And China's got a veto, an absolute veto. So we've got to start thinking now about how we reduce this critical dependency, and it will take us up to a decade to do it. But this is where you need to think in terms of ally shoring, where you are not just extracting, but you are refining minerals, and you're doing that with critical allies and partners. Now, some of those will be South American, some of them will be Australian, Canadian, there are some European countries that can do it, but also some unlikely partners, Ukraine. Ukraine will be absolutely fundamental to this. Pakistan will be fundamental to it. So, we have a choice right now as a generation. We can either accept that we have lost this crucial element of advantage and ceded it permanently to the Chinese, or we can start to put it right.
You said earlier in the...
Without the regulatory reform to bring it back, none of that will happen. So we have to actually make the trade-offs and show that this is urgent, to your point.
And even in the United States, at the moment, it'll take you 15 years to get planning permission. That's the United States. I mean, God knows what it would be in Europe.
I'm optimistic that will change, though. We'll come back in 2 years and see if that number's declined.
Just briefly, and then we're going to close with the last question to both of you. But you said earlier, and it stuck with me, Patrick, that Taiwan is the new Berlin in this era of a Cold War rising between the U.S. and China. What is your, Taiwan is the critical question. What is your view? When does that crisis ultimately manifest?
Who are you asking now?
I'm asking you to put a timestamp on it. Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years?
So there's a period, and the Chinese have set out the dates themselves. So 2049 is the key date, because by hook or by crook, Taiwan will have reintegrated or reunified, depending on perspective, with Taiwan by then. But of course, Xi has also put markers in the sand around 2027, a date that he advanced from 2035. Now, I don't think that's a deadline. I think that is just a point at which the PLA need to be ready. It doesn't make it the year that they're going to do it, but there is a period, if you like, a decade of living dangerously. And if we can navigate this decade between about now and 2035 and see through the prime driver behind this, which is Xi and his ideology, we might find ourselves in a position where that 24-night, the inevitability of conflict recedes. But this is a decade that we have to navigate really carefully.
That's a more optimistic view on Taiwan than I've heard in a while. I'm going to close the panel because it's screaming at us here on the screen that our time is up. I wish it weren't. But I do want to ask each of you one last question. We've talked about, and I think we've done a good job of covering the major hotspots around the world. What is, in each of your view, specifically the unexpected risk that is not yet being talked about sufficiently? What is the thing that we're ignoring?
I think there are a lot of risks with new technologies and how they integrate into sort of this military domain. I mean, biotechnology, biosynthetics, using AI for nefarious purposes. I think they're easy, they're accessible, they're widespread, so I am worried about that. But on the opportunity side, I think there are incredible opportunities in Latin America today, actually, and in thinking about, especially from the US perspective, the opportunities to create new types of relationships in that region, I think are important and exciting, and we'll see what happens over the next couple of years.
Okay.
Nuclear proliferation.
Nuclear proliferation, yeah. Back on the table, and in a very worrying way, yeah. I wish we had more time for this conversation. I suspect the audience wishes that as well, but I hope that we've kicked off the series of discussions that we're now about to embark into in a way that has set some base assumptions around the set of geopolitical risks that we're grappling with. I thank you both very much for your expertise and your insight.
Thank you.